want to talk today about traditions. Every family has its traditions. My family certainly does. Among them, going to Washington's Crossing every year on Christmas Day. We've done that long enough now that I think it qualifies as an official Garner family tradition. Just like your family, I'm sure, has its traditions. In fact, having such traditions is one of the key things that actually forms you into a family, every bit as much as simply sharing DNA, which is why a family's traditions are as unique to that family as fingerprints to an individual. And it's why marrying into a family means marrying into that family's distinctive traditions. And God help you if you should choose to opt out. Now, by traditions, I don't just mean the special traditions like the things we do on holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving or on family vacations, though I do think that is how we normally use the word. But traditions can also include all the normal routines that a family has, including all the little things that we do every single day. For example, who sits where at the dinner table? You ever notice how people do that? Even if there's nobody else there, you always sit in your seat, just like you do here at church. Also, who drives the car on family outings? Or what you have for dinner on Sunday nights? Or whether you're a mayonnaise family or a mustard family when it comes to your sandwiches. All that is tradition too. Even how and how often you brush your teeth. Of course, no one ever calls brushing your teeth a tradition, but in every sense of the word, it really is. If you don't think so, just try getting someone to change how they do that. In other words, by traditions, I mean all of those things we do, both special and routine, that are familiar, which of course literally means of our family. And it's only human nature then to begin to equate all of our traditions, all those things that are so familiar to us, the way we do things day in and day out, to begin to equate all of that with the truth. That is to say, with the way those things are supposed to be done. That's the point made in the quote that I have printed this week on the bulletin cover, and I think truer words were never spoken. Which then is why traditions are both a source of strength within a family by holding things together in an orderly, predictable, and secure way, but at the same time are also a potential source of conflict with just about everyone else in the world, with everyone outside your family, all those whose traditions are not the same as yours, and therefore are not familiar to you, and sure aren't the truth, at least not in your eyes. This can create problems, and they are problems that we all have to deal with from time to time in our lives. For example, when we go off to college for the first time and have to share a room with a complete stranger who's got a completely different set of habits and routines than you. Problems. Or when we get married. Everybody loves their spouse. Everybody knows all the big things about your spouse, but very often you don't know all those little things that can begin to irritate you after a while. Not that that ever happened to me, of course. You can also have problems simply by moving to a different part of the country. where all of a sudden the things that are so familiar to us, the things that we take completely for granted, turn out to be not familiar to anyone else, or not anyone else's traditions, not the way they think is the right way to do things. And what do you do then? How do you live in a world where your traditions are not anybody else's? Now, of course, when you're 18 years old, that's all kind of exciting. When you're 65 years old, like me, you find it considerably less exciting. And this is the problem. When traditions collide, that the Apostle Paul struggled with his entire career, at least from the time he began to preach among the Gentiles. Because when Paul started bringing Gentiles home for dinner, in a manner of speaking, there was often trouble in his churches. Trouble in particular between Jews and Gentiles, but I'm sure there was trouble as well between Romans and Corinthians, or between Ephesians and Galatians, or between Philippians and Colossians, because all of them were people with different traditions, and therefore, deep down inside, different ideas of the truth, of the way things are supposed to be done. There's nothing strange or surprising about that. It's just purely human nature. It's just the way we all are. But it's something we should keep in mind when reading Paul's letters. You see, I have this theory that when we read Paul, we're always trying to turn his letters into theological arguments. But by doing so, we overlook the fact that quite often Paul is really not speaking so much theologically as he is just dealing with very practical matters having to do with problems that have arisen in congregations. And a good example of what I'm talking about can be found in the 4th chapter of Romans, the chapter we read this morning, a chapter that is notoriously difficult to make sense of. But in large part, I think that's because we read this chapter, and certainly all the commentaries read this chapter, as a theological essay on grace versus works of the law as the means of justification of our becoming righteous in the eyes of God. Now, at some level, no doubt that's true. But if that's all we see going on here, then I think we're ignoring what is surely the relevant fact that the law, in the eyes of Paul and the people Paul is writing to, the law is not just a theological idea. It was tradition. It was the tradition for those in the Roman church who, like Paul, came from a Jewish background. And as their tradition, it's how they lived their lives. It's what they were familiar with. It was the way to do things. And at that gut level, it was in their eyes very much the truth for them. But not for the Gentiles, for whom the law, which remember is the Jewish law, was most certainly not their tradition. It was not the way they lived their lives. It was not what they were familiar with, and it was for sure not the truth in their eyes. So you can just imagine what it was like trying to get everyone in the church at Rome to agree on the menu for their congregational dinners. I mean, when Paul says here in Romans 4, the law brings wrath, he wasn't kidding. But I also don't think he was speaking particularly theologically. I think he was just stating the facts of what happens when someone tries to force their traditions on someone else, or what happens when someone else tries to force their traditions on you. When that happens, you're going to have trouble. And it's the kind of trouble, frankly, it's the kind of wrath that can stir things up so much within a congregation that it blinds everyone involved to the much more important truths where you may be in complete agreement. Which is where, then, for Paul, grace comes in. And not just God's grace either. This is the kind of situation that happens all the time in churches. Anytime that anyone wants to change almost anything. And when that happens, when you have a clash of traditions, when you have a difference of opinion as to the way things are supposed to be done, then everyone has to show a little bit of grace and pull back a little bit from forcing our traditions on others or expecting everyone else to do things exactly the way we think you ought to do things. At times, we might even be called upon to give up a little bit of our traditions in order to make it easier for others to do the same. Not because such graciousness or tolerance is a worthy end in and of itself, but because it helps us to maintain the unity of the larger body on those matters that are most important to us, those things on which we can all agree. And so in Rome, that meant keeping focused on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and not getting hung up on who ate what, or in our own day, on who was marrying whom. But again, that's very hard to do when someone is messing around with your traditions, with the way you've done things your whole life, with what is for you familiar. And that is just one more reason why it is so important for us to keep our eyes on the big picture, on the long term, on the concerns of the Spirit, rather than those of what Paul calls the flesh, meaning all the stuff of everyday life. And that's what I think this encounter between Nicodemus and Jesus was really all about. Nicodemus here is trying to bring Jesus back within the fold, calling him back to what is familiar, to the traditions that they were both raised with. I can just see Nicodemus here putting his arm around Jesus and saying, "Jesus, we know you're a man of God," meaning by that, we know you're one of us. But Jesus, aware that the Spirit of God was at work in the world doing something new, doing something really big, he's not interested in just going back home, as it were. No, Jesus wants to move on into the new world that the Spirit was at work bringing about. Poor old Nicodemus, though, is so locked into the familiar, into his own traditions, that he literally can't see what the Spirit is up to, what is happening in the world around him, where things are headed under the influence of God. And I do think that Nicodemus's problem is one that affects all of us at one time or another, because we love our traditions, and for good reason. They're what is familiar. They're the glue that holds our family together, and they really do provide us with a strong sense of security. And that's never easy to let go of, and for good reason. But still, there comes a time in all of our lives when we have to let go of what's familiar, to let go of what we're used to let go of everything we're most comfortable with so that we can move on into the world where God's Spirit is leading us. And that, of course, is why we regard Abraham so highly, not only in the synagogue, but also in the church. Because that's exactly what Abraham so famously did, not once, but several times over the long course of his life, times when he picked up and left behind everything that was familiar, including his family, in order to move on to a land where nothing was familiar, except for one thing, that being God. For it was God who was calling Abraham to leave his home and go where the Lord would lead him. And when that happens, there's only one thing you can rely on, and that is faith, which is why faith is so important when we're headed to places we don't know exactly where they are. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forever.